Hello, my name is Aline Abreu. I'm a PhD candidate of the Institute of International Relations of PUC-Rio. Continuing the HASOW series of interviews, today I talk with Javier Navarro of MSF, Mexico and Central America. Thank you, Javier.
Thank you.
So the first question, how is violence constituted in Honduras? What are its main expressions in this scenario, and what are the main differences between the forms of violence identified in these settings and the ones identified in war contexts?
Thank you, Lynn. Well, I think it's important to mention first that MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, as an international medical humanitarian organization, basically doesn't work directly with violence, but focuses its intervention in treating or mitigating the medical consequences derived of this violence. What we see in this region, in Central America, is more specifically, is a huge increase in terms of the impact and the exposure to violence. It is known the rate of homicides in this region, but also what is most worrisome for an organization like MSF is the amount of people that suffer medical consequences derived of that exposure. Medical consequences that might include injury, that might include disability, and sexually transmitted diseases or infection as consequence of rape. That is the focus of our intervention, and it is through medical treatment of these conditions that we are able to intervene on a relevant basis in this type of region. Basically, in Honduras, what we saw is that for each person that is killed, 7 are injured. And what this exponential increase in terms of the medical needs derived of violence is creating is not only a difficulty for the people to access services, but also a difficulty from the services to be able to cope with those level of needs. What we saw initially, for example, in the cases of sexual violence or rape, is an increased number of barriers suffered by the patients themselves to access services, because they were either fearful of retaliations, because they didn't know where to go, or they didn't know the consequences of the issues, but also certain barriers associated to the health structures where we also needed to work, more related to similar issues but experienced by health personnel. At the same time, we saw that this type of barriers are not only in terms of accessibility, but also in terms of availability. As I mentioned before, the structures are just reaching a point where they're just not able to cope with the number of patients that we're seeing, not only derived directly from the consequences of violence, but from the emergencies. And that is the type of work that we are basically reinforcing in this type of settings.
Which vulnerabilities are identified in this scenario, and which sense these vulnerabilities legitimate the humanitarian action in urban contexts?
Basically, the criteria for intervention for Médecins Sans Frontières, for MSF, in this type of settings is the same as they are worldwide. We basically understand that there needs to be an increased exposure to a certain condition, in this case the medical consequences of violence, and also a lack of capacity from either governmental or non-governmental institutions to cope or to respond. As I mentioned before, that is a scenario that replicates in this region, and particularly in Honduras, because of the difficulties to cope with the medical consequences of violence that we saw. Basically, what we have been doing differently in this type of settings is also learn by treating patients, fine-tuning our approach and our medical approach by reinforcing our proximity to the patients. In particular, in Honduras, we work with a community-based outreach, medical outreach, providing first aid treatment to people already in need because this type of exposure to violence, and that allows us a privilege, I would say, contact with the community and with the community leaders. That somehow, together with a proper communication of our action and our principles of independence, neutrality, and impartiality, and also humanity, allow us to increase our acceptance in the community through the provision of relevant medical services. We are also seeing as one of the likely differences with other settings is that we no longer work in isolation. We work together with other networks of NGOs to which we are able to make referrals for specific things that are not covered by MSF teams, and at the same time we also work together with Ministry of Health structures. In that sense, we are able to reinforce the capacity of these services that are already overloaded, and provide a relevant medical response to the consequences of violence. That leads to a process of engagement that I think is fruitful for both the organization, for MSF, and also ministries of health, and at the same time allows for a humanitarian intervention that provides, that fills the gap and builds the bridge towards the next step that would be more focused on development or real reinforcement of these structures in the longer term.
Thank you for the interview. The HASOW series continues next week. Learn more about the project at hasow.org.